I love you, Lord. Let's sing I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. Now, everybody's heard that before, right? Anybody, how many have never sung that before? A couple. Man, you guys are heathen. You need to get out more. Nobody's going to raise their hand. Every time I call for people raise it, and I mess them up. All right, here we go. Ready? I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. I think you did better on the second one. All right, let's sing The Goodness of God. And hopefully I remember how this starts. Now everybody in the audience point at the piano player. It's you! I love you, Lord, for your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head back down, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire in the darkest night. You are close like no other. I know you as a father. I've known you as a friend, and I will sing of the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. 'Cause your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after me. All my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God. Amen. All right. Be seated. We have special.
Great is the Lord, he is holy and just. By his power we trust in his love. Great is the Lord, he is faithful and true. By his mercy he proves his love. Great is the Lord and worthy of glory. Great is the Lord and worthy of praise. Great is the Lord. Now lift up your voice. Now lift up your voice. Great is the Lord. Great is the Lord. Great is the Lord, he is holy and just. By his power we trust in his love. Great is the Lord, he is faithful and true. By his mercy he proves his love. Great are you, Lord, and worthy of glory. Great are you, Lord, and worthy of praise. Great are you, Lord. I lift up my voice. I lift up my voice. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord.
All right. Thank you, ladies. Do we want to do a little bit of trivia tonight? Who votes yes? Who votes? Who votes no? I have three or four no's, and I had about 5 or 6 yeses. So let's do it. We'll do a quickie one. All right, we'll do a quickie. We haven't done it in a while. I think last week we didn't have Sunday night service, and the week before that I was sick, right? So it's been about 3 weeks, and then I think the last Sunday night that I was here, I don't think we did this. So it's probably been about a month since we've had some Bible trivia. So we might as well do it here. All right? I think we have enough people now to where we can side versus side. What do you think? Who says side versus side? This side's all voting for side versus side. I don't know. I think that says something. They're pretty confident. Bring it? You're saying bring it? All right. Watch out. Lori's ornery tonight, all right? I mocked her work. No. We're going to do side versus side. And quiz out is at, we'll make quiz out 6 tonight. I'm going to be generous, all right? Eric, what are you doing way back there? Why are you back there like a teenager with a bad attitude? What? Oh, no. The spiritual teenagers sit up front. Cool and spiritual? I don't know if the two are synonymous. I'm not sure. I mean, you can stay there if you want to. I'm okay. All right. Eric, I call you out because I love you. All right, here we go. Quiz number 14. Everybody's like, oh, Pastor, stop picking on Eric. Quiz number 14. Here we go. Okay. Who am I? Now listen, you got to put your hand. That's not the question. Everybody knows who I am. That's the category. All right? Nick. Okay. Category is who am I? First one that Brother Deke sees, the hand up. Okay? There hasn't been a question yet. All right, number 1. I was known as my brother's spokesman. I was Ava. Abraham is incorrect. Over here to this side. Aaron is correct. Good job. All right. The left is on the board. All right, number 2. Along with Aaron, I helped to hold up Moses' arms. Her is correct. Good job. She renewed herself. 1-1. All right. I had a strange experience in which a donkey talked to me. Balak is incorrect. Balaam, from the cool teenager in the back. All right, good job. Number 4, my father didn't want me to go back to Egypt with my brothers. Jaden? Benjamin is correct. All right, good job. Along with my 3 Hebrew friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and... That is correct. All right. Number 6, I failed to restrain my evil sons. Eli is correct. All right, tied up 3-3. All right, there are 16 questions. All right, this is question number 7. I was made queen in place of... Esther is correct. Good job. When God called me to be a judge of Israel... That is incorrect. I'm sorry. I sure can. When God called me to be a judge of Israel, I asked him for a special sign which involved a fleece. Gideon. Nice. Good job. That is correct. Wow, you're a visitor and they know your name already. This is great. You're already fitting in. This is awesome. All right. All right. Here we go. Number 9. In an attempt to kill the baby Jesus, I had all little children. Herod is correct. 5-4. Here we go. When told that I was about to die, I asked the Lord for more. Hezekiah is correct. Good job. Good job. All right, here we go. Number 11. My father sent his servant back to our homeland. That is correct. This site is very enthusiastic. All right, here we go. Number 12. I once used a stone for a pillow. Jacob is correct. All right, here we go. I am known as the weeping prophet. Jeremiah is correct. I was the father of the boy who slew a giant named Goliath. Jesse is correct. All right. 2 questions left. This side's up by 2. So this side needs to come through here. Number 15, I was afflicted with boils from the... Job is correct. All right. The visitor with the clutch answer. All right. This side's suffering so much they're bringing in ringers. Hey. Yes. They found her in like in another church. Like, come on, you got to come over here. We need you for trivia. All right, number 16. Here we go. If this ties up, we're gonna have to come up with a death match. Not a death match. What's it call it? Sudden death. There we go. Thank you. Nobody's gonna die tonight. All right, here we go. Number 16. I was very unhappy because my father, who was king, hated my best friend. Jonathan is correct. Wow. Wow. That was like Michael Jordan with the 3 at the buzzer. All right. I'm sorry. That was like me at the 3 at the buzzer. All right, we need a tiebreaker. Okay, here we go. Okay. According to Genesis 5:5, who lived to the ripe old age of 930? I believe you are correct. Yes, Adam. Good job. All right, good job. That was pretty good. It was pretty clutch. Very suspenseful. All right, let's turn our Bibles. Romans chapter 11, picking up in Romans after 3 weeks here. Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11. And we're going to pick up with verse number 13 tonight. Romans chapter 11, verse number 13. we won't take time to review from where we left off, but just understand that chapter 11 is part of the triplet of chapters here, Romans 9, 10, and 11, where the Apostle Paul is basically answering the question, if the system of justification by faith is better than justification by works, and not every Israelite who is Jewish is automatically God's child because they're Jewish. If you have to become God's child by faith, then what about the promises to Israel? Are they null and void? Are you saying they're null and void, Paul? And Paul responds with 3 chapters of the book of Romans, basically answering that question, saying, no, the promises to Israel are not null and void. They're still in effect, okay? And he goes on here, and he comes to Romans chapter 11 and is kind of continuing that answer. National Israel has been judicially blinded, and we covered that in these previous verses here. Paul talks about the fact that Israel has a blindness over them. And during the church age, when Christ, in the Old Testament times, Christ was using Israel as the primary tool to carry out his plan of redemption, okay? But that switched when Christ came. He came unto his own received him not. They rejected the Messiah. They crucified the Messiah. He died on the cross for the sins of the whole world. He ascends up into heaven, and he's been up in heaven ever since. And so from that time until now, we are in what's called the church age. I alluded to that this morning. And so Israel has basically, it doesn't mean the promises to Israel are null and void. God is going to go back to dealing with Israel during the tribulation. So he's not done with Israel, okay? But they've been put on the back burner. And that's what Paul is basically going to spend the rest of this chapter saying, okay? Verse number 13, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. So let me paraphrase verse 13 and 14 here, and I think this is probably where we left off last time. But Paul is saying here, basically 13 and 14, he says, listen, one of the main motivations that I have as an apostle, all right, verse 11, 12, 13, 14. One of the main motivations that I have as being an apostle to the Gentiles is that the more Gentiles I lead to the Lord, the more Gentiles there are to be a witness to the Jews. Okay? So the Apostle Paul is saying, listen, I want the Jews to go to heaven. I'm not against the Jews. I'm Jewish myself. And my brethren, my heart's desire for Israel is that they might be saved. He goes as far to say, I think at the beginning of chapter 10, that he almost wished himself accursed for Israel's sake. If Paul could be accursed, if Paul could give up his salvation so that the rest of Israel could be saved, he'd be willing to do it. That's what he's saying. Now, that's not possible, but Paul's saying I'd be willing to do that. And he's not lying either, because he's saying that under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So this is how burdened he is to see Israel come to the Lord. Okay? And so verse number 15, for if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? And so here's the argument that Paul has been making, is that because Israel rejected the Messiah, he came unto his own received them not, they rejected him. Now the gospel has gone to primarily the Gentiles because they have received the gospel. And so someone who's not saved is not going to be a witness of the gospel. It's just not, it doesn't work that way, okay? Generally, saved individuals are the ones that are propagating the gospel. So if the Gentiles believe the gospel, then guess what? The Gentiles are going to preach the gospel to whoever will listen. And if the Gentiles are the ones that are hearing the gospel and getting saved, then naturally this is going to continue. This is going to be a cycle that's going to continue, and the gospel is going to be propagated among the Gentiles. So God's basically, this is something that it's all part of God's plan. In other words, God saw this happening from the beginning. He knows the end from the beginning, okay? He knew this was going to happen, that the gospel was going to go to the Gentiles primarily during the church age. It starts out, Christianity, in its fledgling stages, after Christ directly ascends up into heaven, is primarily a Jewish belief. I mean, all the disciples are Jewish. The church is filled with a bunch of Jews, but that doesn't last very long. By the end of the first century, there's a dramatic shift that's taken place to where Christianity is no longer Jewish. It's mainly Gentile now. And it's remained that way for the last 2,000 years. Okay? And so what Paul is saying is that basically, from a certain perspective, you can see that the gospel has been propagated to the Gentiles because, cause and effect, because the Jews rejected it, okay? And because of the Jewish rejection, the gospel has swept over the Gentiles like a wave. It's just spread across the world there. So that's what he's saying here in verse 15. For if the casting away of them, talking about the Jews, be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? So, again, verse 15 is presenting a contrast here. It's saying if the casting away of the Jews has resulted in something that is good. Now, again, let me refer you back to Romans 8:28, a very famous verse. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose, right? So God is complex enough. God is a good enough God to where he can take bad things and work it out for good, and he can take good things and work that out for good too. So in this case, we would look at the casting away of the Jews, so to speak, nationally. Not individually, but nationally. I'm not saying that it's impossible for an individual Jew to be saved. That's absolutely false. But nationally, the casting away of the Jews because they've rejected the gospel, that's a bad thing, and yet God has still brought good from that. Well, if God can bring good from something that is bad, then what do you think God could do with something that is good? And that's the point that he's making in verse 15. He's saying, if the casting away of them has resulted in the reconciling of the world, then what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Life from the dead. It's a miracle. It's a resurrection. Life from the dead is a phrase that is talking about it would be miraculous, nothing short of miraculous. Think about this is what Paul's saying in verse 15. Think about the incredible revival that would sweep over the world if the Jews, as a nation, all of a sudden realized, oh man, we missed the boat. Jesus is the Messiah. And then all of a sudden they started following the teachings of Jesus and started following, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. There would be a worldwide, this is what Paul's saying, there would be a worldwide revival. In other words, Paul is saying, listen, Gentiles, you think that, that revival is taking place now with the casting away of the Jews. Just wait until one day when they get right with him. One day when they recognize him as the Messiah. And this is Paul makes a prediction. Paul makes a prophecy here. This is kind of the beginning. He starts alluding to it in verse 15, but he's going to continue on here along this thought process, and he's going to end up making a prediction, more or less, that this is going to happen to Israel, that there is going to be a national revival, and Revelation will expound on this. I believe this is going to happen during the tribulation period, where in Revelation chapter 7. All right, turn to Revelation chapter 7 really quick. This is not in my outline. Let's just take a little bit of a rabbit trail here. we're on the subject, but we're off the subject, but we're on the subject. Revelation chapter 7. And we see here, the JWs love this chapter, but they're completely wrong. Verse number 2. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. So there's 144,000 Jewish preachers that are sealed here. Now, everybody likes to talk about the mark of the beast. You know, Satan is an imitator. Satan never comes up with his own stuff. He always copies God. All right? And in Revelation chapter 7, we see the mark of God here. The Bible says that they're sealed with the seal of God, okay? And these are God's preachers, Jewish preachers after the rapture. The Jews, there's this national revival. 144,000 Jewish preachers are, all of a sudden, they realize, oh man, who the Messiah is. And they spread all around the globe preaching the gospel. And in verse 9, so it goes into all the different tribes. And verse 9, after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, and no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands, and cried with a loud voice, saying, salvation to our God, which sitteth upon the throne and upon and onto the Lamb. And all the angels stood around about the throne, about the elders, the four beasts, and and worshipped, et cetera, et cetera. Now, who is this great crowd? And verse 12, saying, amen, blessing, glory, and honor, wisdom. Now, verse number 13. And one of the elders answered, saying unto me, what are these which are arrayed in white robes, and whence came they? And I said unto him, sir, thou knowest. And he said to me, these are they which came out of great tribulation, and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, this great crowd that we see in verse number 9, I believe, was led to the Lord by the 144,000 Jewish preachers that spread across the planet preaching the gospel during the kingdom of the Antichrist, during the tribulation period. All right? And Revelation chapter 14 gives us a little bit more of an insight into those. I'm going off the top of my head here. Verse 1. And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. Again, there's that mark that they received, the mark of God. Verse 2. And I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. Verse 3. And they sung, as it were, a new song before the throne and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. Okay, so again, we see by Revelation 14, all 144,000 have been killed, and they're standing before the throne of God, all right? But we don't really have time to develop that, but the whole point, the reason why I went there is because I think that's when this national revival in Israel is taking place. It's taking place during the tribulation period. The church is raptured out of here, and there's 144,000 witnesses, and then there's two more witnesses that is mentioned in Revelation chapter, I believe it's Revelation chapter 11. So anyway, the point is that this national revival, Israel as a nation, is going to come to the point that they miss their Messiah, and they're going to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in Israel is going to. This is where the wheat and the tares are going to be separated, that parable of the wheat and tares, okay? That's during the tribulation time, the wheat and the tares are going to be separated from one another. But by the end of the tribulation, because there's going to be a line that's drawn in the sand, the Antichrist is going to draw a line in the sand. Anybody that's on my side, come over and take the mark. If you take the mark, you're on his side. If you refuse because you say, no, Jesus is the true Messiah, we trust in him, everybody on that side of the line is going to be killed or is going to have to go into hiding, and except those days be shortened, no flesh should be saved, the Bible says. Okay? So it's going to be a very bad time. But those 7 years are the years where basically God lets the Antichrist put tremendous persecution on mankind and draw a line in the sand and choose people, make people choose which side they're going to get on. And so this causes, again, a national revival. Now, verse 16. For if the first fruits be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. Now, what in the world does that mean? Okay. Well, first of all, let's read verse 17, because there's a connecting word, and, okay? And you know, whenever you study the Bible, you got to look for certain clues. There's connecting words, and if you see a word if, that means there could be a conditional statement being made. There's different clues that you look when you study for the Bible, studying the Bible. And verse 17 starts with and, so it's connecting a thought. All right? And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. So, I think verse 17 kind of helps us to understand verse 16, but you also have to have some cultural understanding of what this is talking about. The first fruits were the first part of the harvest. There was the feast of first fruits in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse number 19, also mentioned in Numbers 15, verses 19 through 21. And so the first fruits was the first part of the harvest, okay? And the feast of the first fruits, the offering of the first fruits, is you would take the first part of the harvest and offer it to the Lord, all right? And the point there is that you give the very best. You give the very first to the Lord. And then afterwards, for the rest of the harvest, you would go and harvest the rest of it, and you would use that, you know, for yourself. So the point that he's making here in verse number 16, for if the first fruit be holy, that means that the first fruit of the harvest is holy. The lump is also holy. That means once you give the first fruits, then you can use the rest of it. All right? The rest of it is approved for harvest, for taking that harvest and using it. All right? If the root be holy, so are the branches. Now, here's what let me kind of break down what Paul is saying here in verse number 16. And I think we can look at some words here in verse 17 and conclude what Paul is saying. All right? Let's read verse 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree. So who is thou in verse number 17? Who is he talking to? Well, back up to verse number 13, and he gives us that answer. Okay? Because, again, it's the same continuing thought from 13 all the way down to 17, and he keeps on going. So the thou in verse 17, look at verse 13. For I speak to you, who? So who is the thou in verse 17? The Gentiles. And if some of the branches be broken off, thou being a wild olive tree, so the Gentiles are equated to being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them. So what would the them be in verse number 17 in contrast to the Gentiles? What's the only other option from being a Gentile or a Jew? So the Jews then are the them in verse number 17. And with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. Okay? So you have basically Gentiles and you have Jews. All right? Now, so if the Gentiles were the wild branches, then the Jews, follow this, the Jews are the natural branches. Okay? What is the root? So you have a tree. You have some natural branches which represent the Jews of Paul's day. And then you have some wild branches that were grafted in. How many are familiar with the art of grafting? If you took 7th grade science or whatever, this might be something that they highlighted just briefly. There might be a page in your science book on it or whatnot. Maybe not, I don't know. But anyway, grafting is where if you have a plant that is doing particularly well, and let's say you have some good branches, but that plant has come on some, I don't know, hard times or whatever. I'm not a horticulturist, all right? I have a green thumb in my body. But you can snip off a good branch of a bad plant. Maybe the branch itself is doing okay, but the plant's starting to die. You want to save this branch. You snip off the branch, you take it, you put a slit. You take a razor blade, you put a slit in another tree. All right? And you can take the branch of one tree and graft it in, kind of tape it up. I've tried to do this myself when I was younger. It didn't work for me. But I've heard you can do it, all right? Search it on YouTube. It's possible. You can make it happen. And that branch, if you do it right, will grow into that new plant. So they can actually take like an apple tree. You can get say you have a tree that produces golden delicious apples. You can take a branch from like a different kind of apple tree. Give me another apple. What? Macintosh. You can take a Macintosh. You can take a Macintosh branch and graft it into a golden delicious plant, and that it'll grow, and you can get different apples from the same tree. I know, it's crazy, right? You can do it though. And so this is the example that Paul is using here with the Jews and the Gentiles. So the Jews are the natural branches. The Gentiles are grafted in. They didn't really originally fit. Okay? So then verse number 17 then, when thou being a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. So from the context of Paul's assertion that God has not given up on Israel or cast them away, the first fruits were, and here's what I believe the root and fatness of the olive tree represents, okay? Some people would try to maintain, some commentators I've read try to maintain this root and fatness of the olive tree represents God. It represents Jesus, okay? And I guess that in a certain sense that makes sense, but I don't think it really fits the context of Paul's illustration. I think the root that he's talking about here in parallel with verse 16, where it's talking about the first fruits of the harvest and then the rest of the harvest, okay? The first fruits would represent the first Jews, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, okay? God reached them. Abraham was the first one God came to as far as, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And Abraham said, yes, sir. And he followed the Lord by faith. Okay? So Father Abraham was Father Abraham not because he was born Jewish or because God was playing favorites, but because he chose, Abraham could have said no. But Abraham believed God, and it was counted onto him for righteousness. All right? Justification by faith. So the root then is the patriarchs. They were the first fruits, the first harvest of God's redemptive plan, so to speak. Now, there were other saved individuals before that, but we're talking about specifically within the context of Israel and the Gentiles. We're addressing the question. Remember, the whole question of the 3 chapters here is, has God cast off Israel? Okay? So Paul is saying here, the root of the olive tree is the patriarchs. They were the first fruits in verse 16. They are the root in verse 17. And from that root has grown national Israel, But national Israel, verse 17, look at verse 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, some of the natural branches of Israel have been broken off. Why? Because they didn't accept the Messiah by faith. They're wrapped up in the law. They're not the true children of God because they haven't followed God in faith. So they've been broken off. And thou being a wild olive tree, the Gentiles being a wild olive tree, are grafted in. Why? Because they did accept the Messiah by faith. All right? And with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. Okay? What is he referring to? He's saying that the patriarchs, although Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were Jewish, they were the children of God by faith also. And that's the true olive tree here. Children by faith. Okay? So some of the Jews, some of the Israels that came from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were children of faith. David, okay, King David, Solomon, these were part of the natural branches. But then you have some people who were Jewish. King Ahab is not in heaven. Okay? Jehoram and these other kings who were Jewish, but they were not. They were cut off. They were broken off. And throughout the course of history, Christ comes, and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they all rejected the Messiah. They're broken off, and then the gospel goes to the Gentiles, and they're grafted in. They're partaking of the same system of justification by faith. And this is what the olive tree represents. This is the illustration. Okay? So that's what Paul is saying in verse number 16 and verse number 7. Now here's the point. Before we move on, I just want to, Paul's main point in verse 16. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. Here is what I believe Paul is saying. You don't just harvest the first fruits and then walk away from the harvest. Remember, Paul's point with this whole thing is that God is not done with Israel. He's made some promises to Israel that he will fulfill. He's not given up on Israel. Just like a farmer plants a field and he harvests the first fruits, guess what? You better believe he's going to harvest the rest of it. He doesn't just harvest the first fruits and then walk away and wash his hands and say, all right, I guess we're done. No. If he harvests the first fruits and gives them to God, you better believe he's going to go harvest the rest of the crop. That would be a complete waste of his time if he didn't. So Paul's point is that if God started this whole thing with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he made promises to them about Israel one day being in his kingdom and inheriting the land forever and all this stuff, you better believe what God started, God will finish. That's the point. Okay? Now that's put on hold right now during the church age, like a little bit about what we said this morning. Okay, so verse 17, and if some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So verse 18 is written to the Gentiles. So here's the point. He's saying, Gentiles, you're saved by faith. Now don't get all heady and high-minded thinking that you're all that and looking down at the Jews and saying, they missed the boat. We are... God is working through us now. God has cast off the Jews, which is honestly what some churches teach. There is a theology called replacement theology. It's believed and adhered to by a lot of Reformed churches, where they preach the gospel and everything, but they believe, because their theology's messed up, they believe that the church has taken the place of Israel, that Israel is now, they refer to like Revelation chapter 2, of the synagogue of Satan, and that God has abandoned Israel and that all the promises that God made to Israel has been absorbed by the church. Okay? And this has led to, this has had some implications by some of the, your doctrine determines your actions a lot of time. And unfortunately, there has been anti-Semitism that has arisen in church history during the Protestants, Protestant Reformation, the 1500s and 1600s. The Jews were persecuted, not just by Catholics, but by other denominations like Lutherans and different things out there because, again, of their theology, where they believed in this reformed theology that said the Jews were evil because they crucified Jesus. And God has cast them off, and now the church has replaced Israel. That's not the case. That's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what we believe, okay? And so, and Paul is being very clear. I don't know how you could hold to that theology because Paul is addressing that in Romans 9, 10, and 11. He's being very clear here that God has not cast off Israel. God is not done with Israel as a nation. So he's saying in verse number 18, boast not against the branches. You wild branches that have been grafted in, don't boast yourself against the natural branches. Don't say, oh, you guys were broken off and we're God's new favorites. Okay? Why would Paul feel the need to say that? Because there is especially in the first century church, but it's not gone. It's still in our churches today. There is a racial and cultural division that exists in the first century church. Jews against Gentiles, Gentiles against Jews. And it's very easy to play off of those racial divisions and justify them with bad theology that says, oh, you guys are broken off, we're grafted in, we're the new players in town, okay? We're God's chosen people, and you're out. And that's why Paul is, again, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is saying, no, don't boast yourself against those branches that were broken off. Why? Verse 19, thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in, okay? And verse 20, Paul says, well, yes, that's true. They were broken off that you might be grafted in because of unbelief, not because of any merit within yourself, Gentile. The gospel didn't come to you because you deserved it. It's not because of anything you've done or because you're worthy. So don't get any pride in your heart thinking that you're something or that you deserved it. Here's the thing. It is possible as Christians, this is how sinful and wicked we are. It is possible to get pride in your heart over the fact that you trusted Christ as your Savior. You can actually get pride in your heart and look at other people who are sinners as though those evil and wicked heathen, I'm so much better than them because I've trusted Jesus. And we can look our noses down at sinners with judgment rather than compassion. You see, that it's a completely 180-degree difference on where you land based upon what's in your heart and what's in your mind. And this is what Paul is appealing to. Paul is saying, listen, Gentile, yes, you trusted Christ, and yes, the gospel came to you, and yes, you had faith in him. But guess what? That's not through any merit of your own. They were broken off not because you were worthy, not because God saw anything in you, but out of God's grace. They were broken off because of their unbelief. That's on them. And because of that, the grace of the gospel came to you. You know, it's so easy to see, you see somebody with, tattoos all over and gauges in their ears and everything. And, as a believer, you're kind of like, ugh, But in reality, the way that we as believers should look at someone who's rough, who's obviously got their footprint in the world and this culture, rather than trying to keep them at arm's length, rather than being intimidated by them and saying, oh, I don't want to speak to them, that's scary. You ought to walk up to that person confidently and say, hey, let me give you a track. You know, Jesus loves you with a compassion in your heart that's concerned for their soul. That's the proper love and attitude that a Christian ought to have. But unfortunately, a lot of times, church can become this, and I don't think it exists too much here. So this might be preventative maintenance. But church can become this who's who theatrical performance on a Sunday morning where all come dressed up in our shirt and tie all put together. And everybody, puts on this air of having their life together, and we're holy and righteous. If you have a church that's filled with everybody, if everybody at church, and this is probably going to be counterproductive, but if I had a church that was filled with everybody wearing a suit and tie, I'd be a little bit concerned. You know what that would mean to me? We're not doing a very good job of reaching the world. I honestly want people here that some people in suits and ties and are again, not that you wear a suit and tie doesn't mean you're spiritual, but there's a certain presentation that goes along with it. But I want a church sprinkled with people that have pink hair and tattoos and gauges. You say, well, are you crazy, Pastor? You want a church with, yes, that means we're reaching people. That means that everybody that's coming here is finding this place as a spiritual hospital. They don't come here and stay that way, but they feel the love of Christ here, and they're welcomed here, and we love them. And that's the way that it should be. That's the way it should be. That's the way Christ was. He was accused of being a glutton and a wine-bibber by the Pharisees because he got down in the gutter with the tax collectors and with the drunkards. Not that he engaged in that with them, but he got down with them in the mud to reach them and lift them up with the gospel. And that's the kind of attitude that I think that as a church we ought to have. This kind of attitude that Paul had to reach Israel with the gospel. I honestly don't know that I could ever say what Paul said, where he wished himself accursed if Israel would get saved. I don't think I would be willing to go to hell for anybody. As a matter of fact, I know it. There's no way. But he has such a burden. And, we could all stand to have a little bit more of that burden for the lost. And see people as whether or not Jew or Gentile, as in need of a spiritual hospital. But by the grace of God, there go I. In darkness, in ignorance, in a lost condition. I've been born, in a Christian home honestly born with a spiritual silver spoon in my mouth. And those of you who are in our Christian school, those of you that have been born in a Christian home, and don't ever take that for granted. Don't ever take that for granted. That you avoided a lot of pitfalls. You ought to be grateful for that. You ought to thank God for that, young people. And don't waste what you've been given. Cherish that. And go to the next level. Go to a greater spiritual level than your parents ever did. And reach new heights for the Lord. All right, that's it. We'll draw a line there at verse number 17, and we'll continue on, or verse 18 rather, and we'll continue on next week. Let's pray.